Good evening. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Ambassador Gurjit Singh. Welcome our viewers. We are very pleased to have a very famous thinker, diplomatic personality, and a scholar, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, on the 43rd episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee. Today is Monday, June 8th, 2026. It's 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in United States, and it is 8:30 p.m. in New Delhi. Ambassador Gurjit Singh presents us with a very unique perspective. He is a retired diplomat, served as an IFS officer for 37 years. He served as India's ambassador to several countries, including Indonesia. He was also India's ambassador to the ASEAN as well as to African Union. He is also now in post-retirement phase an honorary professor of arts and humanities at IIT Indore and has more than 5 books to his credit. And we are very pleased to discuss today his latest book, The Durian Flavor, India-ASEAN relationship after 10 years or a decade of act, eats policy. So welcome, Ambassador Gurjit Singh. It's a pleasure to have you again on our platform.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee, for inviting me and for your most gracious words. Thank you.
So looking at the book, I must confess I have not read the entire book. It's too dense, 288 pages, but I did browse through. Where did the inspiration come from to write this book?
Thank you. So, my book on Africa, The Harambe Factor, was over 500 pages. And the inspiration for that came because whenever anybody would search for India, Africa, they would get China, Africa. And India was the byproduct. So, to correct that, I had written the book on India and Africa, coming from my experience of having lived and worked in Africa and having been an ambassador to the African Union, in whose time the first two India Africa summits started. Once that book was done, it became 10 years of the Act East policy. So I have also been, as you said, ambassador to the ASEAN. So I said, why didn't I put this? Because I was there when the strategic partnership with ASEAN was announced. I was there when the Act East policy was announced. So I have seen many of these things happen. So let me give you an insider's view and perspective on how we do. And I believe what I have provided is not only the Indian view, but also how I saw the ASEAN reacting. Because unless we understand that, you don't get success in your engagement. And that is why the book is called The Durian Flavor. The durian is a unique fruit. It's only grown experimentally in India. It's not an Indian fruit. It is not jackfruit. But it is the king of fruits in many ASEAN countries. In Singapore, there is a large auditorium which is like a half durian. Jakarta is often called the big durian. Cambodia, this capital, has a building looks like a durian. So the durian is one of those fruits which nobody will let you take into a plane or into a hotel. But
Because
there'll
of the
be plenty
putrid
of
smell.
curiosity because of the smell. So outside you can have it, and once you have bitten into it, you will either detest it or you will love it. Either way, you will not stop talking about it. So that was my reason that I wanted to compare ASEAN to the durian from India. That I don't think we are fully used to it, but in order to build a future relationship with ASEAN, we need to get used to the uniqueness of ASEAN, and I think get used to this aroma without having to hold your nose. And that will make us better acquainted. So I think that, and of course, the other factor is many of my books have titles which are flavors of food. So this is also one of them.
A personal question. The book is dedicated to Sardar Jagjit Singh Bawa on his 100th birthday. So that came into inspiration for writing this book.
Indeed, all my books are dedicated to some members of my family, my children, my wife, my parents, my grandparents, you know. But my uncle, he's IPS 1951, Sardar Jagjit Singh Bawa. He turned 100 in February when this book was coming out. So I thought this would be my way of honoring his legacy because he is a very profound thinking man, totally agile in his mind and body. So I dedicated to him, and he was mighty pleased. And he said, Not only have I never seen anybody's 100th birthday, I've also not seen anybody to whom a book is dedicated on such a day. So he has a very chirpy sense of humor. But I was very happy that I could do this.
So coming back to India and ASEAN, I have a very troubling question. In your opinion, what was the reason, indeed, that India did not join ASEAN when it was conceptualized? And my understanding is that India was invited.
Right. So in my early chapter, I think the introduction, I have gone into this rather deeply. And with the help of my former professor, Professor S.D. Muni, who has researched a lot on this and written about it, I went into this question. So ASEAN was created in 1967 and among 5 countries who wanted the American security umbrella so that the Vietnam War does not come onto them and they don't become dominoes of a communist onslaught. Now, India was not in that boat. India was non aligned. Out of the 5 ASEAN members, Indonesia was non aligned, but Philippines and Thailand were American treaty allies. So they were not that much in common when they first came to life between us and them. I think the earliest time that they asked us to join them and meetings took place was around 1980 when P.V. Narasimha Rao was the foreign minister. At that time, you want to say something, sir?
Yeah, I think around that time in 1967, we still had this US-led military alliance called CATO.
Yes,
And pretty much
yes,
all the members of the ASEAN, some of the members of ASEAN were members of
yes,
CATO, the so-called
yes.
Manila Pact.
Correct.
And
Philippines and Thailand, yes.
yeah, my understanding is that when ASEAN was conceptualized, they wanted to be separate. They wanted to be a different grouping than just an extension of CATO. And it
I
was,
think that happened much later. In 1967, I have not found any record to suggest that they were looking for a balance or they were looking for other countries. They were simply trying to get the American security umbrella to protect themselves from a domino effect of the Vietnam War. And please remember, in 1967, the Vietnam War is not going well for the Americans. So that is their fear. But I found records that in 1980, India and ASEAN held meetings at the level of secretaries to discuss an engagement. Now, what happens is that around that time, there is a problem in Kampuchea where Hun Sen takes over. And I was a young officer in 1980, and I was present when Hun Sen's ambassador quickly presented credentials in Delhi so that he could attend the non-aligned foreign ministers meeting. I was present that day. Now, this annoyed these ASEAN countries terribly. because they did not want anything to do with Hun Sen. And they now saw India aligned to Hun Sen. The India-ASEAN engagement had actually gone quite far. And it was expected that Foreign Minister Rao will go to the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting and have a discussion which will lead to some kind of partnership. At that time, ASEAN had only one partnership with China, Korea, and Japan. That's it. They didn't have it with anybody else. But ASEAN took this to heart, this recognition of the Hun Sen regime. And Mr. Rao decided not to go because it was unclear that the plans would go through. And he didn't want to come back with nothing in hand. Now, I asked this question to the ASEAN colleagues that when you always saw India as a functional partner, why did you neglect India in 1980 on a strategic issue? Hun Sen was a strategic issue. I mean, India's willingness to engage ASEAN was not diminishing because we recognized Hun Sen. And many years later, Hun Sen has been an honored part of ASEAN. But to this question, there was no answer. So that was a lost opportunity. But in my book, I have clarified that I don't think the blame entirely lay with India. India and ASEAN were both playing a larger strategic game. And ASEAN decided that the strategic game was more important than a functional engagement with India, which I think was unfortunate. I think the second time something similar happened, and again, the meetings did not go through. Similar hedging, Russia, Russia was a problem to them. They thought India is in the Russian sphere of things, and we thought they are in the American sphere of things. So things weren't quite working out. But in 2000 and then finally a sectoral dialogue partnership starts in 1992 after India has announced the Look East policy. After that, in 1996, they upgraded to a dialogue partnership at ministerial level. Now, please remember, Pakistan was also admitted as a sectoral dialogue partner in 1992. Until today, they remain a sectoral dialogue partner. Whereas India went on to become a dialogue partner at the ministerial level in 96 and then a summit partner in 2002 and a member of the East Asia Summit in 2000. If you allow me, I'll tell you a nice anecdote about the first summit. Prime Minister Vajpayee and Brajesh Mishra had invested very heavily in the ASEAN relationship. And the first summit was to take place in 2002, which was in Cambodia, which had only joined ASEAN in 1999, by the way. So it was Cambodia's first ASEAN summit, and India was invited there for its first summit with ASEAN. Till then, we had ministerial meetings. And the date that they chose for the summit was Diwali. So on the Indian side, there was much consternation. How will we go on Diwali? But I think Prime Minister Vajpayee said, we have invested far too much in this to now let it go because it is Diwali. We will go and celebrate Diwali with the Cambodians, who are, after all, our civilizational brothers. So on Diwali day, the India-ASEAN relationship was strengthened by a summit meeting.
So talking about ASEAN at this point in time, a lot of critics will say that it's really not a functional organization and it has become dysfunctional organization. What is your take on that? Whether it is functional or not functional, or whether it will go the SARC way?
Go the SARC way because there is no major strategic battle between any of them. There is a Cambodia-Thailand border skirmish, but it's not that serious. Myanmar is the problem, but it's a problem where ASEAN itself does not agree on how to solve that problem. So Myanmar is more or less suspended from ASEAN. They did not get their turn to host the summit. Now, ASEAN prides itself on its unity and centrality. Now, its unity is actually cleaved. now, because on Ukraine, on Gaza, on Myanmar, and now in Iran, there is really no common point. On Myanmar, they did work out a 5-point consensus, but it did not work. And since then, groups of ASEAN countries have been following their own path in all these major international issues. Where centrality is concerned, they are unable to deal with issues in the region which impact everybody. They are unable to conclude a code of conduct on the South China Sea with China. They don't have a unified view among themselves on China in the South China Sea. They don't have a unified view on Myanmar, which is within ASEAN. They don't have a unified view on Quad or AUKUS. So the centrality part, which meant that all the partners acted through them or discussed through them, that has become more difficult. For China doesn't discuss, the Americans don't discuss, Australia, Japan, India are ready to discuss. But then we have to remember that the Quad are all members of the East Asia Summit and are all dialogue partners of ASEAN. But they don't feel ASEAN is doing enough, so the Quad is created. The same with AUKUS. All AUKUS partners are dialogue partners of ASEAN and members. No, UK is not a member, but they're all dialogue partners. So this is where the problem comes. And at the same time, if you see when the Iran crisis came and Philippines took over the chairmanship, they quickly put aside the agenda they wanted to pursue and immediately looked at the energy crisis. And they took 2 or 3 decisions. One was that under the ASEAN rubric, oil producing countries should support other ASEAN. The second was the ASEAN power grid, which is largely run on hydropower on mainland ASEAN countries, should be activated so that the impact of oil is reduced. And the third was to increase renewable energy. So I can see that ASEAN was ready at this stage to revive some of its moribund provisions in order to take a common view. But yes, people feel that on strategic issues, they are not able to come together. On functional issues, whether it's the economic community, the socio-cultural community, or the political defense community, they seem to be doing much better. But my point in the book is that we need to look beyond ASEAN and work with countries on an ASEAN plus policy. So if you see, since January last year, when Indonesian president came for the Republic Day, then we have had the Thai Prime Minister, the Malay Prime Minister, recently the Vietnam president, and now we have the Foreign Minister of Laos, Foreign Minister of Indonesia. So there is a flurry of activity with ASEAN, which is largely bilateral, where ASEAN and the region are also discussed.
So the problem with ASEAN in not being able to negotiate a code of conduct is because of China and China's preference for bilateral accords with each of those countries rather than a multilateral accord with ASEAN. And in that process, ASEAN has become highly divided. Countries like Malaysia, they are more under Chinese influence. Similarly, Cambodia, that always acts as a kind of spokesperson for China within the ASEAN. So the fault lines of ASEAN are Myanmar, Cambodia, and in certain ways Malaysia. And that has been one of their major failures, not being able to negotiate. It's the relationship with China. What is your impression on that?
Perceptive comment, sir. So let me try and explain. When the Code of Conduct was negotiated in 2002, the final document was called a Declaration on the Code of Conduct, meaning that now we'll discuss a Code of Conduct later. So all that we have is a DCOC, which all countries of ASEAN agreed with China. But from in 2012, China started occupying islands contested by ASEAN countries and claiming exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea, again contested by some ASEAN countries, and said, this is mine. Now, this was not a conflict with the whole of ASEAN countries. It was a conflict with four ASEAN countries: Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and Philippines. Indonesia kept saying, we are not a party to the conflict, till one day the Chinese came into the Natuna Sea. So the Chinese claim part of the Natuna Sea, not the island. So they are actually a contested party, but they don't want to admit it. Now, among the other four, the Philippines and Vietnam at different times have either taken confrontationist or coordinated positions. Initially, Vietnam was the confrontationist. And Philippines, even though they had won the arbitral award in 2016, their then President Duterte took a friend with China approach and did not challenge them. Now the Vietnamese have gone quiet and don't challenge the Chinese, whereas the Philippines is linking up with Australia, US, Japan, even ready to defend Taiwan, so long as they are defended from the Chinese Coast Guard. In 2017, at the Golden Jubilee ASEAN Summit, China had more or less occupied everything it wanted to occupy in the South China Sea. At that stage, they went to ASEAN and said, fine, we are now ready to discuss with all of you. The DOC with all of you. Now, that opened these cleavages that you mentioned among ASEAN countries. The non-claimant five do not have the same approach to China the claimant five have. And within the claimant five, as I told you, Vietnam, Philippines have had different views, but Indonesia does not want to confront them. And Malaysia and Brunei largely following an ostrich policy, see no evil in their vicinity and not challenge China at all in the South China Sea. So this is the differentiation among ASEAN countries, which is actually leaving China sitting pretty. They don't have to do anything.
They are using divide and rule policy of colonial masters kind of thing in this era. So from this being the major failure of the ASEAN, let's come to what, in your opinion, is the one single major achievement of the ASEAN.
I think the biggest success of ASEAN is its original centrality. It provided the avenues for regional discussion on issues and confidence building measures before things got out of hand. Now, till the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea in 2012, these avenues actually worked quite well. The ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, all these actually gave opportunities for rival powers, the United States, Russia, China, North and South Korea in the ARF, Japan, India, Australia, all to say what you want there. So very often the discussions took place limiting any conflict. But once the Chinese challenged the South China Sea, that is the time the rest of us decided that we are not going to let ASEAN give in to the Chinese in the South China Sea. So we formed the Quad, and the concept of the Indo-Pacific came out. So through the Indo-Pacific, we have quietly challenged Chinese hegemony. And the Chinese don't like the term, so they kept telling ASEAN never adopt this term. So they always use the term Asia-Pacific.
Asia-Pacific.
But in 2019, ASEAN created its own outlook for the Indo-Pacific. And then China said, fine, we understand you. So there is an AOIP, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific now. It is largely a functional, not a strategic concept, but it is there on how the Indo-Pacific. So ASEAN believes, and also through the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which over 100 countries have signed, ASEAN creates the avenue for countries in the region not to go to war, Well, that doesn't seem to apply to China. That is the problem. And they have no means of enforcing it.
Despite the strategic confusion within the ASEAN forum, one of the economic successes has been the RCEP. What are your views about ASEAN being able to negotiate RCEP as it's one of the major economic achievements?
In my view, the RCEP is not a success. It is floundering along. And frankly, if you really want them to look at it hard, without the Indian market, the RCEP has no value. That is why, if you see, after India withdrew from the RCEP, there were three very difficult countries for India within the RCEP negotiations. One was China, one was New Zealand, and one was Australia. But now you see Australia and New Zealand have, for strategic reasons, signed CEPA or CETA with India. And I think very soon Prime Minister will visit both those countries and these agreements will be finalized. So the Indian market is a big draw. But India wants, in return for that market, certain things like investment, trade in services, a balanced field for Indian investors, and many such things, which ASEAN could not get China to do. And many ASEAN countries themselves do not give India the same favorable treatment they give others.
Yes.
Even though some of them are our strategic partners. Third, if ASEAN was so disappointed as they say they are with India withdrawing from RCEP, why doesn't ASEAN conclude the review of the ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement, which has been hanging fire for 3 years? And it was supposed to be finished by end of 2025. And today we are in mid-2026. So at the moment when India is ready and willing to sign FTAs, as you can see on the west side, ASEAN is again missing this opportunity. So this concept of trade trust is somewhat diminished with ASEAN.
ASEAN historically was inimical, along with its other partners, for India's participation in APEC. And that anti-India stance has been reflected over a period of time. And of course, now India is not concerned about what APEC does, but I think there's a background to it about, trade mistrust with India, because ASEAN as an organization and each individual countries were very vocal about not letting India come into APEC. Any comments on that?
I would say that it was not ASEAN taking that position. ASEAN had no position. It was individual countries taking that. It was particularly Malaysia. Malaysia under Mahathir in the 1990s, when India launched the Look East policy and made overtures towards APEC, which had been set up in 89, Mahathir wanted something called the East Asia Economic Caucus. And he did not want to include India in it. And it was his objections which kept India out of APEC. But in 2000, and then after some time, there was a moratorium on APEC membership. But in 2013, when Indonesia was the chair of APEC, I was the ambassador, the Indonesians told me, we want to reopen the moratorium and we want to invite India to be a member. But China vetoed that. So, as I said, Indonesia also an ASEAN country. Singapore and Indonesia have been more keen to get India involved in the region. Malaysia, less keen. The others, I don't think, had a hard position. So when the East Asia Summit was created in 2005, it is Singapore and Indonesia who made sure that Malaysia wanted the East Asia Summit simply to be ASEAN plus China, Japan, and Korea. Whereas Singapore and Indonesia said, no, we must balance this. Let's bring in India, Australia, and New Zealand. That is how we got it. So ASEAN doesn't have a unified view on this. Individual ASEAN countries take their own positions.
So we had issues with ASEAN on bilateral India-ASEAN free trade agreement. You alluded to it. We had problems with ASEAN about entry into APEC. There are some issues about, ASEAN centrality, whatever it means. I think it is a silly notion because they don't have a unified strategic policy overall. So you cannot insist on ASEAN centrality if you have internal divisions. Where do you put the Indian initiative of Ganga Mekong initiative vis-a-vis some of the ASEAN countries? What is the status of that?
So in my book, there is a chapter on regional initiatives. So these are extra to ASEAN. But I thought they are relevant because they have ASEAN members. BIMSTEC is one. IORA is another. There is another small arrangement between Thailand, Myanmar, and Indonesia for local trade. And there is MGC, Mekong Ganga Corporation. These are not ASEAN affiliated arrangements. They are separate. But ASEAN countries are members. So in Mekong Ganga, the archipelagic ASEAN countries are not members. It is mainly the
peninsular
inland countries who are members. And among them are the CLMD, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Thailand. These four countries, being LDCs, have benefited a lot from India's efforts through quick impact projects to build their capacities. And ASEAN is very grateful to us because under their narrowing the development gaps and integrating ASEAN initiative, India played a major role for bringing up the CLMV countries. Now, the same projects we talk about in ASEAN, we talk about in BIMSTEC, we talk about in Mekong Ganga, but yes, many of them started under the Mekong Ganga cooperation. But Mekong Ganga cooperation has been a stop-start kind of a organization. It does not hold meetings regularly and much depended on the chair. And these countries often did not give it priority. It is like BIMSTEC, no? Unless the chair takes interest, nothing happens. So what we have done, I think 3 years ago, is that India has become the permanent co-chair of the NGC. And one of the other would be the annual rotating co-chair. So we have some semblance of order. And meetings have taken place. I think EAM has held a ministerial meeting last year, if I'm not wrong. And that helps. So I think as an adjunct of the process of ASEAN, BIMSTEC, IORA, and Mekong Ganga are very important
from Indian
arrangements that we must work with. Yes.
So we had Look East policy, Act East policy for more than a decade. Where do we go next?
So I think a job of a diplomat nowadays is to keep conjuring up new adjectives. So we started with strategic partnership of ASEAN 2012. I think in 2022 or 23, when we reached 25 years, we made it the comprehensive strategic partnership. So at 30 years, we did not add anything to it. At 35, let's see. But that is ASEAN. Look East was our policy. I was in Japan when Look East was launched. The purpose of Look East was largely economic, to bring India's liberalization to the minds of our partners. And the focus was on the capital surplus countries like Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan. And ASEAN was included, but not the major target other than Singapore. Whereas the Act East policy, some people said at that time that Modi likes to rebrand everything into his. But my book, which is entirely about the Act East policy, shows that this is not the only reason. The Act East policy took the Look East policy and brought ASEAN at the center instead of the East Asia. Secondly, instead of focusing only on the economic side, it focused on political defense and on socio-cultural and connectivity, the four pillars which in 2015 ASEAN announced at its three communities and cross-cutting connectivity. So India is now engaged much more widely with ASEAN in these areas. And our action plans, the new ones started in 2026, go up to 2020, 2030, are actually very fulsome. The problem is we also fund them quite nicely, but we don't have a visible project which I can point to you and say, Dr. Adityanjee, please see, that is India ASEAN. We don't have that. We have a lot of capacity building, a lot of support to teaching, to schools, to human thing, but we don't have a high-speed railway with the Chinese build or something like that. The solution lies in working with Japan and Korea in particular and Australia into doing trilateral projects in ASEAN, where we can raise the scale of what we are doing because we have capabilities and they have capabilities, but their costs are too high. For instance, the Japanese say they are ready to produce their destroyer in an ASEAN country. Now, India also has shipbuilding. Of course, we would like them to build it in India. But certainly, we can join with the Japanese and build it in an ASEAN country. That will reduce the costs and open up bigger markets. Another area where I think we can do much, much more is critical minerals. Critical minerals, China dominates the supply chain in ASEAN countries, whether it's Myanmar or Indonesia or wherever. But I think we need to come in with greater heft through our national critical mineral mission and its expansion and enter into supply side arrangements which will lead to progressive use of processing in ASEAN countries with Indian support, Indian technology, Indian investment, and also the support of Japan, for instance, like we are trying to do in Africa. So if we want to build a China plus one supply chain, then this is the model we need to do, work with Korea and Japan and Australia in ASEAN.
I perfectly agree with you because 5 years ago, I wrote a few articles proposing a different kind of arrangement called Indo-Pacific Cooperation Organization, IPCO. And if you have some time at any point in time, some of these articles were published in bology.com and myin.net.
Okay.
So I have addressed those issues because Look East policy, Act East policy, time has come to be the East policy. You have to be totally integrated. And if APEC does not accept you, then you need to start a new kind of arrangement. And that is where IPCO came. But it was a pleasure to have you, sir, on this platform because we are running short of time. We'll continue this conversation maybe in a later setup, whether this platform or some other platform. But thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to recommend to our viewers that read this scholarly book. If you are interested in Southeast Asia, Durian Flavors, India and ASEAN after a decade of Act East policy is rich source of information, diplomatic, economic. And again, thank you very much indeed to come on our platform.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanjee, for having me and for your very perceptive questions, which helped me to bring out the essence of the book.
Thank you very much.